The diner was quiet that morning, the hum of the old coffee machine blending with the soft chatter of early customers. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. At a small corner table, a man sat alone, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His clothes were worn and patched, and a weathered cap covered his hair, but his eyes were sharp, alert, and calm. This was Marcus, a homeless veteran, a man who had seen more battles in his life than most could imagine, yet now found himself invisible to the world. People walked past him, glancing briefly before continuing with their morning routines. To them, Marcus was just another face in the city streets, another soul forgotten by time. But in those quiet eyes was a story, a past that held courage, sacrifice, and a strength that could shake the very foundations of authority. He sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the bitter warmth, as if drawing comfort from something only he could feel. The door to the diner opened with a jingle, and in walked two police officers. Their boots echoed on the floor, cutting through the morning calm like a warning. They were loud, their presence immediately demanding attention. The first one, a tall man with a hard jaw, scanned the room before his gaze landed on Marcus. The second, younger, leaned back slightly, smirking as if this would be an easy encounter. Marcus looked up casually, his expression unreadable. He did not move, did not flinch. The officers approached his table with purpose, their eyes narrowing. "Hey, you," the taller one said, leaning over slightly. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Marcus remained silent for a moment, then gave a slow, calm smile. "Just having my coffee," he said softly. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that seemed to make the officer step back slightly. The younger officer laughed. "Coffee? Looks more like you're causing trouble," he said, glancing at Marcus's tattered clothes and worn shoes. "We don't like loitering in this town." Marcus didn't argue. He simply continued to stir his coffee, letting the tension build. Around them, the diner seemed to shrink, the clatter of dishes and the low conversations faded into the background as the confrontation took center stage. Other customers glanced nervously at the scene, unsure if they should intervene or stay silent. Some whispered to one another, feeling the unease that Marcus carried without a single word. The taller officer leaned closer, his face now only inches from Marcus. "You hear me, old man? Move along. Now." Marcus looked at him steadily, his calmness unshakable. He didn't reach for his wallet or his backpack, didn't stand or raise his voice. He simply smiled faintly and said, "I'm just sitting here. No harm done." The younger officer's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to this. Usually, people obeyed, or at least argued nervously. Not Marcus. There was something in his eyes, a quiet fire, that made them both hesitate for a moment. "You don't get it," the taller one said sharply. "You're lucky we don't haul you down to the station right now." Marcus's hand moved slowly into his coat pocket. The officers stiffened, their instincts telling them this was the moment things could change, but they had no idea how. Marcus wasn't reaching for a weapon, he wasn't threatening anyone. He pulled out a simple, worn cell phone, the kind many would overlook as ordinary. Yet in his hand, it was more than a phone. It was a bridge to a world that the officers could not even imagine. "One call," Marcus said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for the officers to hear. The younger officer laughed nervously. "One call? What are you gonna do, call your grandma?" "We're not scared of you." Marcus's smile didn't falter. "Not my grandma," he said softly. "But someone who cares about justice." The taller officer leaned in, now visibly irritated. "Look, old man, you don't want trouble. Just finish your coffee and leave." Marcus took another slow sip, his eyes meeting theirs calmly. The diner seemed frozen in that moment. Even the clatter of dishes and the whispers from other customers held their breath. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone could feel it, something was about to happen, something none of them expected. Marcus dialed the number carefully, fingers steady. The officers watched, puzzled, their bravado fading slightly. Other customers stole glances, curiosity mingling with fear. Marcus's calm confidence was magnetic, it drew attention without a word, and the officers didn't know what to do next. As the phone rang, Marcus's gaze never left the taller officer's eyes. He was unshaken, unbroken, and fully aware of the power he now held. One phone call could change everything. One call could shift the balance of authority in the room. And in that quiet diner, everyone knew, even if they didn't understand it fully, that this ordinary-looking man was about to reveal something extraordinary. The call connected. Marcus spoke softly, almost whispering, but the tone was firm, commanding. The officers' expressions changed. The smirk was gone from the younger one's face, replaced by confusion and a creeping sense of fear. Something in Marcus's voice, or the person on the other line, made them realize they had misjudged him completely. For a moment, silence dominated the diner. The coffee machine hummed, the sunlight slanted across the floor, and Marcus sat there, quiet and composed, a calm in the storm he had orchestrated without raising his voice or causing a scene. The stage was set. The officers had no idea what was coming. Marcus had waited for this moment, had prepared for it, and now, in this unassuming diner on a quiet morning, the world was about to shift, one call at a time. The diner had grown tense. Every customer seemed to sense that something unusual was unfolding, though no one could predict the outcome. Marcus remained seated, his hand resting lightly on his phone. The two officers were now shifting uneasily, their earlier confidence beginning to crumble. They thought this would be an easy encounter, a routine show of power, but Marcus was not ordinary. The taller officer leaned closer, voice sharper this time. "Who are you calling, huh? Some friends of yours gonna bail you out?" He tried to sound intimidating, but a tremor betrayed his nerves. Marcus's gaze remained calm, steady, unshaken. "No friends," he said quietly. "Someone who knows the truth." His words were simple, but they carried weight, and it was enough to make the officer pause. The younger cop glanced around nervously, realizing the eyes of the other diners were on them. Some whispered under their breath, others pretended not to notice, but all felt the tension hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The phone conversation went on. Marcus's voice was low, almost conversational, but every word seemed to command attention. He spoke calmly, with authority, and with each passing second, the officers' expressions began to change. Their arrogance gave way to uncertainty, and uncertainty quickly turned to fear. The taller officer finally barked, "Listen, old man, you better." "Shoo," Marcus said softly, holding a finger up to his lips. His calmness silenced him instantly. The officer froze, unsure how to respond. Marcus's presence seemed larger than the room itself. There was no aggression in him, yet no one doubted the power he carried in that moment. A memory flickered across the taller officer's mind, a distant story about Marcus. He had been a decorated veteran, a man who had risked everything for his country. But now he was homeless, sitting quietly in a diner while two officers tried to assert control over him. There was a shock in realizing they had misjudged him so completely. Meanwhile, Marcus's conversation continued. His tone was measured, calm, almost gentle, but firm. Whatever he was saying, it was clearly making an impact. The officers could no longer hide their growing unease. The younger one shifted from foot to foot, glancing nervously at Marcus. He had never been confronted like this before. He had never met someone so composed under pressure, someone who seemed untouchable in his stillness. Other diners were now fully aware that something significant was happening. Some watched with wide eyes, leaning forward slightly, curiosity mixed with fear. Others whispered to each other, trying to figure out what kind of person Marcus really was. And Marcus? He sat there quietly, like a calm sea in the middle of a storm, ready for whatever came next. Finally, Marcus ended the call. He looked up, and his eyes met the taller officer's with a quiet intensity. "It's done," he said softly, almost casually. But in those 2 words was a power that neither officer could ignore. The taller officer's face went pale. What did you do?" he stammered, trying to regain control, but his voice sounded weak. Marcus smiled faintly, sipping his coffee again as if nothing had happened. "Just made sure the truth was known," he replied. The words were simple, but the officers could feel the meaning behind them. They realized that whatever they had assumed about this man was completely wrong. The younger officer looked around the diner, suddenly aware of the customers' eyes on them. The smirks and laughter from earlier were gone. Even the staff seemed tense, as if they could sense the invisible shift in power. Marcus, the man they had underestimated, now held the upper hand. And it had all started with one quiet phone call. The tension in the diner was thick, almost suffocating. The officers stepped back, unsure of their next move. They wanted to act, to assert authority, but something held them back. Marcus's calmness, his quiet confidence, made them hesitate. Every instinct told them that pushing further could be a mistake. Marcus set the phone down gently. He didn't speak more, didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of a story the officers would not forget. They realized they were facing someone far beyond their expectations, a man whose life had been filled with challenges they could never understand. Finally, the taller officer muttered under his breath, We should go." The younger one nodded, swallowing hard. The once confident duo turned and left the diner quickly, their boots clanging on the floor as they exited. The room seemed to release a collective sigh of relief, but Marcus didn't move. He simply watched them leave, still calm, still composed, knowing that justice had been served quietly, without violence or anger. The other customers slowly returned to their routines, whispers filling the air, eyes stealing glances at the man who had changed the atmosphere of the diner with a single act. Marcus finished his coffee, savoring the quiet, knowing that sometimes, true power comes not from force, but from patience, dignity, and knowing the right move at the right time. As he stood to leave, the sun outside had climbed higher, shining through the windows, casting long shadows that mirrored the morning's tension. Marcus stepped out of the diner, his worn shoes clicking softly against the sidewalk. The city continued around him, unaware of the quiet victory that had just taken place inside that small, unassuming diner. And somewhere deep down, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. The world had seen a glimpse of his strength, but the story was far from over. The city streets were busy, but Marcus moved through them like a shadow. People passed him by without noticing, unaware of the man who had just turned a diner upside down. His footsteps were steady, confident, yet silent. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured more than most could ever imagine. As he walked, his mind drifted back, remembering days long before homelessness, days when his life had a very different rhythm. Marcus had once been a decorated veteran, a man who had served his country with honor and courage. He had faced battles that tested his mind, body, and spirit. There were medals on his wall, certificates of bravery, and letters of gratitude from superiors who had once relied on him to make impossible decisions. But life had a way of changing everything. Injuries, betrayal, and circumstances beyond his control had left him homeless, living day by day, unnoticed by the society he had served. He remembered the night it all changed. He had returned from deployment, carrying scars invisible to the eye but heavy on his heart. He thought he would be welcomed, supported, respected. Instead, he faced bureaucracy, neglect, and a world that seemed indifferent to his sacrifices. Slowly, his life slipped through his fingers until he found himself in the city streets, surviving on scraps, kindness from strangers, and the memories of a past that still burned bright inside him. Despite everything, Marcus had never lost his pride, his sense of justice, or his ability to read people. He could sense fear, arrogance, and deception in a way that few could. That was why the two officers at the diner had reacted the way they did. They had underestimated him, assumed he was weak and harmless. But Marcus carried the strength of experience and a network of people who still respected him, people who knew the truth about the man they thought they could intimidate. As he walked past a park, Marcus's mind replayed the phone call he had made earlier. The voice on the other line had been calm but commanding, someone who could make the officer's actions reach serious consequences. He had not needed to shout, argue, or raise a hand. One call had been enough to shift the balance of power. The city might see him as a homeless man, but Marcus knew that the world still had its rules, and some rules he could use to his advantage. He paused briefly on a quiet street, looking at a mural on a wall. It depicted soldiers in battle, courage written in every stroke. He had once been among them, fighting for a country that now barely remembered his name. A wave of sorrow passed over him, but he didn't let it linger. Marcus had learned long ago that dwelling on what was lost did nothing to change the present. What mattered was action, patience, and timing. And timing had been perfect in the diner today. A small group of people passed by, some nodding politely, others ignoring him entirely. Marcus had grown used to being invisible. Invisibility was a strange gift. It let him move unnoticed, plan carefully, and strike when necessary. The diner incident had been one such moment, a small, calculated move in a much larger life he had been forced to live. He remembered the looks on the officers' faces, the sudden loss of control, the uncertainty that replaced their arrogance. It gave him a strange satisfaction, not for revenge, but for justice. He had not sought to harm anyone, he had only ensured that fairness, respect, and truth were recognized. The officers had assumed power came from uniforms and badges. Marcus knew true power came from knowledge, patience, and the courage to act when others underestimated you. The street stretched on, and Marcus walked past a small cafe, noticing a young soldier in uniform buying coffee. He smiled faintly to himself. Perhaps one day, this soldier would understand what it meant to serve with honor and what it meant to face the consequences of a world that doesn't always care. Marcus had learned lessons the hard way, and every step he took reminded him of those lessons. Eventually, he arrived at a quiet park bench. He sat down, placing his worn coat beside him. The city continued to move around him, unaware of the quiet storm that had passed through the diner just hours before. Marcus allowed himself a moment to breathe, reflecting on what had just happened. The phone call had been simple, but it had changed everything. The officers had left, their arrogance replaced with fear and respect. Justice had been served, quietly, efficiently, and without unnecessary conflict. But Marcus knew this was only a momentary victory. The world he lived in was unpredictable, full of challenges and obstacles. Every day brought new tests, new people to face, and new situations that required patience, wisdom, and courage. And he would be ready, as always. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the park, Marcus stood. He had a purpose, even in the streets where most people saw none. He would continue his life, moving quietly, observing, and ensuring that justice and dignity had their place even in a world that often forgot the value of both. And somewhere in the distance, the city hummed with life, unaware that a homeless veteran had reminded everyone that courage, patience, and one well-timed action could change the course of any day. Marcus walked away from the bench, his silhouette blending with the evening shadows. He had faced fear, intimidation, and doubt, and he had emerged unshaken. The diner incident was just one story among many in a life that had been far from ordinary. And for those who thought power came only from force, Marcus had proven otherwise. Sometimes, strength comes from quiet resilience, strategic thinking, and the courage to act when it matters most. The morning after the diner incident, the city seemed unchanged. Cars honked, people hurried to work, and streetlights flickered as the day awakened. Yet for the two officers, nothing felt the same. Their boots no longer felt steady on the pavement, their confidence had vanished like smoke. Every glance, every whisper in the streets made them wonder if Marcus's quiet power was still watching, still calculating. Inside a small office downtown, the taller officer sat at his desk, running a shaky hand through his hair. The younger one paced the room, glancing repeatedly at the phone as if expecting another call. Their conversation was low, tense. "I can't believe that guy," the taller officer muttered. He's not just some homeless man." The younger officer nodded, voice tight. "One call. That's all it took. And now I can't stop thinking, who exactly is he connected to? Who listens to him? Neither of them realized that Marcus was not seeking revenge. He had not called the police to punish them in anger. His actions were deliberate, measured, designed to protect himself and remind the world that respect and justice could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Marcus walked along a quiet street, blending into the city around him. He carried a small backpack, his steps calm, almost meditative. He could feel the shift he had caused, like ripples spreading across a pond. The officers were shaken, yes, but the real impact would be slow, subtle, and lasting. People in positions of power had been reminded that Marcus existed, and when he moved, consequences followed. Later that day, back at the diner, life had returned to normal, or so it seemed. The staff cleaned tables, poured coffee, and greeted customers with smiles. But the story of the previous morning had spread quietly. Whispers passed from one patron to another. Some called it remarkable, others mysterious. Everyone agreed on one thing: the man in the corner had not been ordinary. Marcus returned briefly, not to confront anyone, but to check on the scene. He sipped coffee quietly, observing the room with calm eyes. The staff offered him nods of respect, and a few of the regular customers greeted him cautiously, curiosity shining in their eyes. They had seen courage displayed quietly, without theatrics, and it left a lasting impression. The two officers, however, were already feeling the pressure from above. Calls from superiors arrived, asking questions they could not answer. A simple report about the diner incident turned into a scrutiny they had never anticipated. Marcus had exposed a weakness in their conduct, not through shouting, fighting, or threats, but through a quiet, powerful move that reminded them of the consequences of arrogance. As the day wore on, Marcus walked through the streets, reflecting on the past and the present. He thought about the life he had lived, the battles, the sacrifices, the mistakes, and the victories. Every step reminded him that resilience was more than surviving; it was knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to make your move quietly but decisively. He passed a small park where children played, their laughter echoing through the trees. A few stopped to glance at him, sensing something different, though they could not explain it. Marcus smiled faintly. Life was fragile, moments were fleeting, but courage could leave a mark long after it was shown. Evening approached, painting the city in shades of gold and orange. Marcus finally found a quiet bench and sat down, placing his backpack beside him. He watched the sky change colors, listening to the soft hum of the city. In that moment, he allowed himself a small satisfaction. He had faced the challenge, held his ground, and reminded the world of the strength that lay in patience, dignity, and the right timing. Yet, even as he sat there, calm and collected, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The officers had learned their lesson, but the ripple of his actions would continue. People connected to authority, people who underestimated him, would begin to feel the impact. And Marcus, as always, would remain observant, ready for the next moment when courage, patience, and quiet action could change everything once again. The next morning, the city felt heavier for the two officers. Every step they took was weighed down by uncertainty. Their colleagues looked at them differently now, whispers following them wherever they went. The diner incident had spread quietly through channels they hadn't expected, and Marcus's phone call had set something in motion that neither officer could stop. Marcus, on the other hand, moved through the city with quiet confidence. He was invisible to most, but the ripple effects of his actions were starting to show. His calm courage had already reminded the world that appearances were deceiving, and power could come in unexpected forms. Back at the diner, the staff were still talking in hushed tones about what had happened. "Did you see him?" one waitress whispered. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten anyone, and yet, the cops left like they'd seen a ghost. The regular customers nodded in agreement, a mix of awe and disbelief in their eyes. Meanwhile, the taller officer sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. Emails from superiors, complaints from coworkers, and reports about the incident flooded in. He ran a shaky hand over his face, realizing that Marcus's one phone call had exposed weaknesses in their authority, vulnerabilities they had never considered. Every message, every reminder of protocol, reminded him that his career could be in jeopardy. The younger officer paced nervously, unable to focus on his routine tasks. Every ring of a phone, every notification, made him flinch. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus, the calm, composed man who had faced them without fear, without aggression, and had already changed the course of their day. Marcus walked past a government building, keeping his eyes forward but aware of the world around him. He wasn't seeking revenge, nor did he crave attention. What mattered to him was justice, respect, and reminding people that appearances could be misleading. He had seen the world judge him unfairly for his homelessness, for his worn clothes, for his quiet demeanor, but today, he had reminded everyone that true strength came from knowledge, patience, and timing. Inside the station, the officer's superiors began calling for explanations. Marcus's name came up in conversations they could not escape. The chain of command had begun to respond, questioning their conduct and demanding accountability. Panic began to creep in, replacing the arrogance they had carried into the diner. Every misstep, every underestimate, was now magnified. The tension didn't stop there. News of the incident, subtle though it was, began circulating among the community. The patrons of the diner had told friends, who told friends, and soon the story reached a wider audience. Marcus's quiet strength became a topic of conversation, a tale of courage that inspired more than a little awe. Back in the diner, Marcus returned for a brief moment to collect a few things he had left behind. The staff greeted him with small nods of respect, and he smiled faintly in return. His presence was a reminder that dignity and courage were not always loud, but they left a lasting impression. The two officers, however, were learning this lesson in a way they could not ignore. Their careers, their reputations, and even their sense of self-respect were now under scrutiny. Every person they passed seemed to watch them differently. Marcus had changed the dynamic without a fight, without anger, and without confrontation. One call, one calm action, and the balance had shifted. As Marcus stepped outside, the sun was high, casting long shadows on the pavement. He paused, taking in the city around him, knowing that the day had been won in a way that only patience, intelligence, and quiet courage could achieve. The officers had learned their lesson, but the impact of Marcus's actions would continue to ripple through the lives of those who had underestimated him. He walked away from the diner, leaving behind whispers of awe, respect, and a hint of fear. The city continued around him, unaware that a single man, sitting quietly in a corner with nothing but patience and one phone call, had reminded people of the power of calm courage. Marcus disappeared into the crowd, a shadow moving among shadows, leaving a story that would not soon be forgotten. By the next afternoon, the ripple of Marcus's actions had grown far beyond the diner. The city's quiet whispers had turned into conversations, and the incident was now reaching people in positions of authority. The two officers felt the weight of scrutiny pressing down on them from all directions. Every report, every call from a superior, reminded them that their arrogance had consequences, and that Marcus, the quiet, composed veteran, had exposed their weaknesses in a way they could not ignore. Marcus walked through a crowded street, observing life around him. People hurried past, some casting curious glances, others too absorbed in their own worlds to notice him. He carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who understood power differently, power that came not from force, but from patience, intelligence, and knowing when to act. Every step he took reminded him that the right action at the right time could shift entire dynamics. Back at the station, the officers were facing real trouble. Their superiors demanded explanations. Internal affairs had been notified, and complaints were being reviewed. The younger officer sat at his desk, fidgeting nervously, reading email after email about their conduct. The taller officer was pacing, muttering to himself, trying to find a way to explain what had happened. But no words could undo the quiet dominance Marcus had demonstrated with one simple phone call. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to the diner briefly, not to confront anyone, but to observe. He noticed the staff exchanging knowing glances, whispers of admiration for the man who had changed the entire room with calm courage. Some regular customers even nodded at him politely, a silent acknowledgement of respect. It was a small gesture, but for Marcus, it symbolized that justice, even quiet justice, had a place in the world. The city was beginning to understand that Marcus was not just another homeless man. He had connections, knowledge, and a moral strength that could not be ignored. People who had initially overlooked him were starting to see him differently. His quiet bravery had sparked conversations about dignity, respect, and the unseen power of someone underestimated by society. At the station, tension reached a breaking point. The two officers realized that their careers were on the line. They had assumed authority came from uniforms and badges, but Marcus had proven otherwise. One call, made calmly and quietly, had revealed their arrogance, exposed their misconduct, and left them scrambling for answers. Panic began to replace fear as they understood the true reach of the consequences they were facing. Marcus, meanwhile, walked to a quiet park bench as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city. He sat down, taking a deep breath. This was never about revenge. It was about reminding the world that respect could not be bought or demanded, it had to be earned, and sometimes, it had to be enforced with quiet determination. His calm demeanor, patience, and strategic thinking had shifted the balance in a single moment. The story of the diner incident began spreading subtly through the community. Patrons told friends, who told friends, and soon, Marcus's courage became a quiet legend. People admired his calm approach, his refusal to escalate conflict unnecessarily, and the way he had made powerful people take notice. The ripple effect was undeniable. Marcus had not only protected himself but had also reminded the world that justice, dignity, and courage could prevail even in small, overlooked moments. Evening approached, painting the city in shades of gold. Marcus rose from the bench, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the streets. He had left his mark without confrontation, without anger, and without aggression. The two officers had learned their lesson in the most difficult way possible. They had underestimated a man they thought powerless. Marcus walked on, quietly observing the city, knowing that his actions had already changed the course of more than just one day. The ripple would continue, spreading awareness, respect, and the understanding that true strength was often silent but undeniable. And somewhere in the distance, the officers would remember the calm man in the diner, the one who had made one phone call that shifted everything. They would never forget the lesson, nor the quiet authority that Marcus had wielded without raising his voice.